At the time of recording, Ryan Coogler's new, dare I say, borderline blockbuster movie called Sinners has only been out for a few days and has already grossed over $60 million worldwide, which includes $45 million here domestically. All of that is on a $90 million budget. So it's looking pretty good for Warner Brothers, for Coogler, for Michael B. Jordan, and for everybody involved in Sinners. When it comes to the prestige at the end of the year, can we expect Sinners to be in that conversation 8 months from now? I'm here to break that down and to tell you why I think Sinners could be an Oscars player this year. What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the Garage. Gerald here with you, of course. Thanks for tuning in, as this is a bit of a case study on my part. A lot of folks have been hitting me up since all these accolades started raining down on the new film Sinners, asking me if I think it's going to be in the Oscars conversation this year. I recently did a couple really in-depth deep dives onto films that I think are in the mix for the 2026 Oscars, and Sinners was not included in that conversation that I had with some special guests. By the way, I'll make sure to tag those on this video for you in case you want to check them out. With that being said, I do feel like the horror genre bias kind of crept into my psyche here, and those videos were made long before I actually saw the film, or really before I had even seen any feedback on the movie. Now, we all know about the horror bias and the Academy. The horror genre and the Academy, or the Oscars, just don't mix well together. They never have historically. People are going to throw out The Substance as an example from last year, which of course was phenomenal, but that is definitely a one-off and a rarity. I've talked about it on this channel before, actually, so I won't go in deep. But there is literally only a handful of times where the Academy has recognized horror on a top-tier level when it comes to the Oscars. And that's in a 97-year history. So while I definitely love the success of The Substance last year, you cannot take that as part of the measuring tool that you're using. But what I'm going to do on this video is I'm going to give you some exhibits, probably about 5 or 6 exhibits, that I'm going to present to you as to why I think is a strong case can be made for Sinners being in the Oscars conversation. And when I say in the Oscars conversation, I wouldn't be making this video if I only thought it was going to be like original song, or which is a big possibility, by the way. I'm doing it because I think there is an opportunity for this movie to be recognized on a top tier, above the line level. I'm talking about things like Best Picture, Best Director for Ryan Coogler, even Best Actor for Michael B. Jordan, a nomination that has eluded his career thus far, even though he's put in some really sturdy work. And then with that, you do have a lot of the below-the-line category stuff that will come with it too. Things like cinematography, I mentioned Best Score, Original Song. There's actually a couple options in this movie for that. We'll talk about that a little bit. Production design and costumes are very, very likely, and that's even if it didn't get anything else. Those two are pretty good chances at this point in the year, knowing what's going to be coming out on the horizon. And even though I don't think the case might be as strong for things like supporting actor or actress or makeup and hairstyling, even those are on the table, as there are options in this movie that could be placed into those categories based on how strong the rest of the field ends up being this year. All right, so Exhibit A, let's start with generally the reception for the film. And I'm not just talking about critical reception, but I'm also talking about the reception at the box office and among the general audience. Now, as I'm recording this video, the movie's only been released to the public for about 3 days, and this is what we're looking at already. I mentioned this on my review of the film, but it currently sits at a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, that 98% means that 98% of the critics that have reviewed the film or have done articles on the film have given it a positive review versus giving it a negative review. So Rotten Tomatoes is a system that's set up for all or nothing. It's essentially a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and it's definitely a very high thumbs up from critics right now. And that's based on 243 critical reviews, which is quite a bit when you're looking at Rotten Tomatoes' general sampling size. Not only that, but there's currently over 5,000 verified ratings from the public on Rotten Tomatoes, which are also very close to that number at a 97%. Quite literally, it means that 97% of the people that saw this and also decided to leave a review on Rotten Tomatoes for it have thought favorably of the film, which is a very, very high number. Other outlets on Sinners that I kind of look at when I'm thinking of Oscars potential, awards potential, or just basically how the film is being received overall outside of my purview are Letterboxd. Letterboxd currently has it rated at a 4.3 out of 5, which is extremely high. Just to put that into perspective for you, we know how well The Substance did last year at the Oscars, like I was just talking about earlier. That one currently has a 3.8 on Letterboxd. And then I was just going to handpick one that's kind of in modern history, not super long ago. How about Parasite from 2019, which in my mind is one of the greatest movies ever made. That one sits at a 4.5 on Letterboxd. So you can see the 4.3 score for Sinners, a movie that just came out that has a pretty eclectic kind of narrative within, is a very high score. Also, Metacritic is sitting at an 84%. Very similar to a Rotten Tomatoes score, but it's weighted a little bit differently. But anything above like 75 on Metacritic is like A+ in terms of reception from the critical community. How about this one? It got an A cinema score. Now, a cinema score means on opening day, they poll the general audiences as they're leaving the theaters. Different theater chains participate in this. I think it's predominantly done in California, New York, the big cities. The public sees the movie, they leave the movie, and they're asked to kind of grade the film or talk about the film a little bit on their way out. If it's a positive review, it goes to this weight of the side of the score. If it's a negative review or kind of a mixed review, it also weights the score a little bit. It got an A. Now that's of note because you have to go back 35 years to 1982 when Steven Spielberg's Poltergeist received an A cinema score. Since then, nothing in the horror genre has matched it. The only films that came close would be The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2, which both also received an A-. So big deal, right? Basically everybody and their mother loves this thing that's seen it. The reason I think that's imperative when you're talking about the Oscars is because if it's a movie that's not well loved, if it's not well received, and you couple that with it coming out in the early part of the year, of course it's April, and you pair that with it being a horror film, or some might say a genre bias that exists with the Academy, I would be one of those people. You're starting to incorporate a lot of ingredients to a bad formula when it comes to an Oscars film. But that is not the case with Sinners, at least on this critical and general reception front. The movie is well loved. I have seen a bunch of people putting it in their best of the year list, best of the decade so far list. Some people are saying it's Ryan Coogler's best film, and he has made some films that, believe me, the Academy has taken notice. The Academy is going to be a little more reluctant to nominate and definitely to give a prize to a film that the public is generally not high on. Not always. We saw it with Emilia Perez this past year, receiving a crap ton of nominations, just one short of the record with 13, which still makes my head hurt. That film, at least in the critical community, was pretty shit on, and it definitely was not in the 98% range. But the Academy still gave it all the nominations. It only walked away with 2 Academy Awards, though. Of course, a lot of that could possibly be attributed to the scandal surrounding Carla Sofia Gascon last season, so I won't put too much weight in that comparison. But at the end of the day, when I'm talking about Exhibit A here, if a movie is well loved, regardless of when it comes out, and is making a bunch of money at the box office, it has a much better chance to ride its way to an Academy Award nomination than if it was not generally loved. Let's move on to Exhibit B because I think they go hand in hand together here. Exhibit B is simply the Academy specifically, but even more so the industry, loves Ryan Coogler, the director. In the past, Coogler's films have received 13 Academy Award nominations, and that's going back not even 10 years, about a 9-year history there, starting with Creed in 2015 when Sylvester Stallone was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. In 2018, Black Panther was one of the most successful films of that year, both critically reception-wise and also box office number-wise. And when it came around to the Academy Awards, it received 7 Academy Award nominations that year, which frankly was a bit of a groundbreaking thing for a superhero or a comic book inspired film. It ended up winning on that night Best Production Design, Best Costume Design, and Best Original Score. It would also repeat in the category of Best Costumes with the sequel Wakanda Forever, and that year it received 5 Academy Award nominations. Now, with all this being said, the kind of top of the line or more prestigious awards have eluded Coogler a little bit, at least when it comes to the prizes. Some of the nominations have been there. Of course, Black Panther being nominated for Best Picture, like I just said. Supporting Actor could be considered a very prestigious award that Sly Stallone was nominated for in a Coogler film. But Coogler himself has not been nominated for Director nor Writing. In this case, previously it would have been for Adapted Screenplay. But here in Sinners, we would be looking at Original Screenplay, which I also think is on the table. Now, aside from being a previous nominee at the Academy Awards for his films at least 13 times, we know that Coogler is well respected and well loved in the community in general. You can get that from watching any pretty much entertainment news channel or even YouTube videos with various friends and colleagues that he sat down with. Or you can listen to the actors that have worked with him on various projects, including Sinners, and his dedication not only to them portraying these characters, but his dedication to filmmaking itself. The guy loves movies, and the Academy loves creators and artists that love movies and that respect what they do. I've actually seen it in a couple different interviews, but there's this whole story that Coogler has told in the last couple weeks promoting Sinners, where he's mentioned how his first date with his wife was to the movies, which I think is very cute to see Bring It On, which was a freaking classic choice for a first date movie, if I do say so myself. But he goes on to say that he was talking to his grandmother about incorporating blues music into Sinners, and she was telling a story about his grandfather, and it may have been great-grandfather or grandfather, I'm not sure, and how he had such a love for blues music and how proud he would be of that being incorporated into the story. And Ryan just ended up asking his grandmother, do you remember your first date? And it turns out their first date together was to the movies.
Because Zinzi and my first date when we were kids was at a movie theater in Oakland. Matinee on a Saturday, right? Our parents dropped us off Jack London Square in Oakland. We went to the Regal Cinemas there. I can remember the weather. You know what I mean? You know, the whole time the movie was playing, though it was a great movie, I wasn't interested in the movie. You know what I mean? And I interviewed my grandmother, and I asked him about my grandfather, who was from Mississippi, and I said, hey, what was your first date? And she said, he took me to the movies. And my mind was just like, poof. And I said, man, what was it like? What movie was it? And she said, well, I had trouble watching the movie because he kept trying to make out with me. And she said, eventually I told him, look, we can do that after. I'm trying to see this movie.
I also bring this up not because it's classic and I love it, but because those types of stories that are connected to filmmaking and connected to the love of movies, which is what the Oscars are celebrating, those are the kind of stories that we're going to hear on the tour, on the press tour, for Sinners, but also during award season. That story that I just told you will most likely come up again if it ends up getting nominated for Best Picture or it's a multiple nominated film. There's also some viral videos going around that Coogler did these little kind of like how-to videos almost with Kodak and with IMAX to explain the different aspect ratios and the way that Sinners was filmed and why it was important for him to film them in various concepts and in various formats. And he breaks it down, and the whole time you can tell he's geeking out and he's in love with what each of them means to different parts of the story and different emotions that he was trying to relay with different characters in the film. It's a very personal movie for him, not necessarily so much because of the subject matter, although it is, and we'll get into that here in a second, but also because of just the technical craft involved in making the movie.
This right here is 35 millimeter film. This was the format for the majority of the industry history. You know, a lot of masterpieces shot on this format. A lot of films that are close to my heart, and it's making a big comeback. You know, like this past film year, ANORA was shot on film. Films like The Brutalist was shot on film. You got some filmmakers that always use the format.
You know, this is the first movie that's an original concept that's all Ryan Coogler's. He even made a sweet deal with Warner Brothers that after 25 years of this movie making whatever it makes for them, Blu-ray, DVDs, re-releases, whatever, he owns it after that 25 years. It's his property and his property alone. And I think there's a reason why he did that, aside from being a savvy businessman and for the longevity of his career, but because this is a personal, human story that is not an IP or being reestablished from something else that somebody else made, which all of his other projects, even though they're phenomenal, Creed was obviously spawned from the Rocky films. Black Panther is obviously based off the Marvel superhero in the comics. So now he has something that's his own, an original story that he wrote, that he directed, that he kind of handpicked the cast for. So this is a film that they're going to know his personal connection to that, and they're also going to feel it. And if they didn't know it, he's going to make it known just by the way he kind of talks about it and how important it is to him, whether you're talking about these one-off videos that he made about Kodak and IMAX, or whether you're talking about the interviews that he's giving and his personal attachment to film and the love of film and why he wanted to move forward with a story like Sinner. When it comes to filmmakers in Hollywood right now, there's a reason why filmmakers like Spike Lee and Christopher Nolan are constantly praising Ryan Coogler, constantly kind of mentoring him. He's a bit of a protege to those two individuals specifically, And he's mentioned that on other interviews, and I've heard him say that. And to have Spike Lee and Christopher Nolan as your mentors, you're going places, okay? If they were my mentor, you think I'd be out here in this garage? Exhibit C is going to be the narrative and the story within the screenplay and the film that we see in Sinners. Now, the promotional materials, the posters, a lot of people's reviews, blurbs, are mentioning that this is a vampire film. A lot of people, including IMDb and Letterboxd and others, are including it in the horror genre. It's not the only genre that it's included in. For example, Letterboxd currently has it in drama, thriller, horror in that order. And I think that's a fascinating thing to kind of build off of what I'm about to say here. Genre filmmaking in general does not perform well at the Academy Awards. If you are a genre film, so if you're pigeonholed, in other words, to a specific genre, if you're just a horror movie, and that's your thing. You know, I think of a movie like, off the top of my head, like Smile 2 last year. Smile 2 was extremely award-worthy if you're looking at the craft of it, if you're looking at the lead performance from Naomi Scott, the direction of Parker Finn. All of that stuff was just as good as anything that got nominated for Best Picture last year. I'll go ahead and tell you that straight up as somebody who loves film. But the one thing that it had that none of those others had, with the exception of maybe The Substance, was the single horror genre tag. On top of that, it was a sequel, which didn't help either, but I'll make my point by just sticking with what I said. When you can begin to incorporate other genres into your storytelling, you obviously increase your chances to be recognized by members of the Academy. Now, what Sinners does that I think is genius is it's really not a horror movie. It is being marketed as such in certain respects, and it does definitely have horror scenes and elements to it, but a lot of that stuff doesn't even happen until the final act of the film, when we get basically like a vampire standoff and we get a lot of that traditional vampire lore. You have to invite them inside, garlic, they die from the sun, all that stuff. But that comes much later in the film. The first like half to maybe even 2/3 of the movie is a drama piece about the Deep South during the Jim Crow era, and about how African Americans were expected to be something that they no longer were. And there's even representation in the film of the dudes in the white hoods. I don't know if YouTube will let me say it, but those hateful bigots. That's obviously a analogy for what's happening with the vampires in the movie and what's happening with the overall story in the film with the twins and their young cousin Sammy in the film. And they just want what they want. They love what they love. But since they are black people, that is something that seems much further away for them than a white person in the same town. So not only is this film much more than a horror movie, it is a drama. It is an important piece of African American culture. It specifically hones in on Southern Mississippi during the Jim Crow era. The production design is flawless to capture that place and time. And there's a lot of dialogue in the screenplay that lends to the struggles of African American people during that time, particularly in southern US. There's even scenes of African Americans picking cotton in the fields, which at that time would have been a pastime that you would hope would be no longer existing. Now, of course, it wasn't under slavery, but nonetheless, it did depict an image that was very loud for us as the viewer, at least me. So make no mistake, when you couple the love that I mentioned that Coogler has for filmmaking, for the history of film, which of course the Academy Awards would be a part of that, and you tie that in with Sinners being a prestige film, which I'm gonna tell you right now, it is. Now the last 30 to 45 minutes, okay, that's a vampire horror movie, sure. The last act is vampire horror, but then it comes right back around to more of the Jim Crow and the racism and how that's kind of the overarching villain in this film, and the vampires are really just puppets of the racism that's being depicted in the movie. At least that's how I took it. But the first 2/3 of this movie is a family drama. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a communal drama. It's about this African American community in Mississippi. They might be the majority in that town, but they still feel like the minority because of the way that the masses are treating them just because of the color of their skin, which unfortunately in 2025, I'm sure a lot of black people still suffer from that. So my point is, racism and the desire to end racism in this country is an ongoing, very important issue. And it's front and center, see what I did there? In the movie Sinners. And because of the genre bias not really even coming into play until 2/3 through the movie, aside from one or two maybe off scenes here and there, I think this makes Sinners a extreme Oscars player that it would really be even hard to say that there was a horror bias to begin with. Exhibit D is a bit more on the abstract or the hypothetical, and my intention wasn't really to get super political on this video, but I will just say that the Academy is aware of the Oscars So White era, which was actually not that long ago, and they're also aware of women being shorted traditionally at the Academy Awards. I mean, they've improved definitely over the last 5 years or so. But this is all pre-COVID, that it was not looking good from a diversity standpoint for the Academy Awards. And if you look at a lot of the players on the docket for the 2026 Oscars, there's not a ton of super colorful films or cast in the mix. I'm not saying we're headed towards an Oscars So White situation all over again, but I will say that could be squashed really quickly by some notoriety for a movie like Sinners, who was directed by a black director in Ryan Coogler, who, like I said earlier, is well loved and respected, and also has a predominantly all-black cast. Now, I think Sinners stands alone on its own without having to have that diversity inclusion, but nonetheless, because the Academy is well aware of that, that may factor into their decision-making when they start narrowing down their different options. In the last 10 years, just to kind of prove my point here, all of these, I would agree with them being worthy to receive a nomination, but nonetheless, they were outlier in their respective categories. Movies like Fences, based on the August Wilson play back in 2016, and Moonlight, directed by Barry Jenkins, which ended up winning Best Picture, by the way. Or how about one of the most notable ones that I think has the best parallels to a movie like Sinners, and that's Get Out from Jordan Peele, which not only received a Best Picture nomination, but also a Best Original Screenplay nomination for Peele. And it ended up winning that screenplay award. That's also a young black voice in Hollywood, very well respected, very well loved, and Get Out is a movie that also blends genres. It is a psychological thriller, a horror, but it's also a bit of a racially motivated drama, which is also what we're dealing with in Sinners. Those two movies, although they take place in very different time periods, and the vampires versus the psychology that's happening with the white folks in Get Out. But if you consider those your two villains or your two antagonistic stories in these movies, the narratives are very, very similar, with a very similar storyteller and a similar cast in terms of the racial components. Other ones would be like Black Klansman from Spike Lee, If Beale Street Could Talk, another Barry Jenkins film that showed up at the Oscars in 2018. Cynthia Erivo received a nomination for Harriet, her first. Of course, now she's got a lot of notoriety going around for Wicked. Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, One Night in Miami, The Woman King, Judas and the Black Messiah, which was also a win for Daniel Kaluuya that year. There is basically a trend of lifting up these African-American black stories, whereas before, maybe 10 years ago, it was a little harder for those to break through. And I think we have those voices in Hollywood now, of which, I mentioned Jordan Peele and some others, but of which Ryan Coogler is definitely one of those. He is carrying the torch for that minority and for their place in Hollywood. And there's a lot of year left in terms of the movies that are going to come out. But as I'm sitting here right now, my inclination would be to say that it would be a shame if a black story as strong and powerful and frankly as entertaining as Sinners wasn't rose up and shown up at the Academy Awards next season. A lot of people are going to say, yeah, but Gerald, Sinners came out in April. It's way too early for an Oscar player to be coming out. What I will tell you is the last 5 years, there's only been 1 year that a movie that came out pre-June did not get nominated, and that was 2022. And in 2021, there were 4 films that came out prior to June nominated for Academy Awards that year. In case you're wondering, those would be, as I mentioned earlier, Judas and the Black Messiah, Nomadland, which ended up winning, by the way, The Father, and Minari. All those films came out in February or March of 2021 and ended up being nominated for Best Picture. And just this past year, Dune Part 2, which received 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, was released in early March. And that film was also shot in IMAX for a lot of it. Multiple aspect ratios, multiple dedication given to the art of filmmaking and for the way that the film was presented to the public, including the Academy members. It mirrors a lot of what Coogler did here in Sinners. So in short, I'm not really worried about the release date. If I had a concern, that would probably be the sole concern. If Sinners had come out in like October or November and received all the scores that I listed to you earlier, the box office success that I gave you earlier, then that would have obviously been a stronger component leading into award season. But I do think that a film like Sinners could have the staying power, much like a film like Dune Part 2 did, because eventually it's going to go on streaming. It's going to have Blu-ray sales. Maybe they do a re-release of it for Halloween. I mean, who knows? So I am confident that with an artist like Coogler and a star like Michael B. Jordan, which is easily one of the biggest marquee names in Hollywood right now, can keep this in the conversation for the next several months. So in wrapping up, I want to show you what I currently think Sinners could get nominated for next year. I've currently got it in my 10 for Best Picture. I did it. I added it in my predictions just a few days ago. I started those predictions back in March, by the way. They're always updated on my website frequently. The link is down below, and I occasionally do videos here on the channel as well. When I get closer to actual award season like November, December, then I'll be doing like almost weekly videos with predictions and power rankings. But as of right now, Sinners is in my top 10 for Best Picture. I also have Michael B. Jordan in the mix for Best Actor. I don't have him in the 5 currently, but I do list that also as a possibility. He's playing dual roles here with 2 completely different personalities in the twin brothers. So I think that has a high level of gravitas that the Academy is going to probably sink their teeth into. And depending on how strong the field is this year, there's a good shot for Michael B. Jordan. I definitely put Ludwig Göransson's score in the mix. Right now, I would have it in my 5 for original score. He's obviously a previous Oscar winner. He's worked with Coogler before, and the score is absolutely phenomenal. I would expect that to receive a nomination without even having to give it a second thought. I've also got it as a strong possibility, as I mentioned before, for production design and costume design. Those two go hand in hand, and Coogler and his costume designer that he works with frequently are no stranger to those categories at the Academy Awards, having won them before. And I think that they might be on to another one here because they're recreating 1932 Jim Crow era Mississippi, and it was done flawlessly. It made me feel like I was actually watching scenes that took place during that era. You also can't count out cinematography. The film looks beautiful. I'm not as strong in visual effects or hair and makeup, although I do think there are possibilities. There's some cool things incorporated when it comes to those 2 categories, but I don't know that they're on display as much as some of these other ones. But I wouldn't count them out completely at this point because we have to see what the rest of this year's docket has in store for us. I'm also hopeful for Best Supporting Actor, mostly for Delroy Lindo, because talk about being overdue for some recognition from the Academy. I still think his snub for Da 5 Bloods, the Spike Lee joint, was one of the worst misses in Oscars history, but he turns in a phenomenal performance here, although I don't know how juicy it is in terms of getting a nomination this year. I also feel really good about Miles Catton. He's a newcomer who plays young Sammy, and he also gives a phenomenal performance. I prefer Delroy Lindo of the 2, but I think both of them are at least in the conversation as we're sitting here right now early in the season. And then the last thing that I think it has a shot for is original song. In fact, I would bank right now that it's going to get at least 1 original song nomination 8 months in advance. I'm telling you that. Speaking of Miles Catton, he has a beautiful song called I Lied to You that he performs in the movie, the single guitar. It's beautiful. But then from even more of a like pop culture connection, Haley Steinfeld, who I love and is a supporting actress in this movie as Mary, she has an original song that she wrote and performed for the movie that plays over the credits called Dangerous. So if they wanted to go with a more popular kind of famous person pick, they could also go with that one as a nomination, or possibly both. If the field in original song is as shallow as it was this past year, then I'm all for it. All right, guys, I know it's early. As I'm recording this video, it's like mid-April. Sinners just came out. People love to hit me in my comments, dude, it's April, like it's so early. Why are you doing that? That's what my channel is, guys. I'm the Awards Garage. I follow award season, but then I continue to follow movies and their potential for the next award season, which is what I'm doing. And I do think that I could confidently say that Sinners is the first real player that's been released in the US this year that is a player for next year's Academy Awards. So at least we have that. Now, will it get 1 or 2 nominations, or will it get 6 or 7? Or possibly it would blank, which I think would be a travesty. We don't know yet, but my whole channel and my whole thing is kind of predicting what's going to happen. And I do think, based on a lot of the stuff I told you in this video, that there is at least a good percentage chance that we see Sinners come up again when we get down to December into award season. I'm also going to tag my review of Sinners on this video. It's a spoiler-free review if you want to see my in-depth thoughts on the film. I loved it, and I called it the best film of the year so far. What did you guys think of Sinners? And more importantly, what do you think of Sinners' Oscars chances? Am I crazy? Is this thing coming out way too early in the year to be relevant for next year's Academy Awards? Or am I onto something? And if I am, how many Oscars do you think it's going to get nominated for? Let me know down below in the comments. And as always, thank you for tuning in. I will see you guys out here next time in the garage.